Yeah, I would like to share a few words. The epic history was something that True Mother asked us to undertake last summer. So we went through various stages of work to bring it to completion.
여러 가지 작업을 거쳐가지고 이렇게 만들었고요.
Currently, as you know, we have UPA cadets at our school, don't we? These cadets come from many different countries. Among them, there is one cadet from Europe. I won't mention specific names or countries in case it becomes too obvious. There's one cadet from Europe. One day, that cadet came to me and said, no matter how much I thought about it, I could not figure out why the Korean people became the chosen people.
그렇게 얘기하더라고요. 그래서
I thought, that's understandable. Europe is a Christian nation. So this cadet, being from a nation with such a deep Christian background, said, why are the Korean people considered the chosen people? No matter how much I think about it, I can't figure it out. So I said, yes, I understand where you're coming from. Then the cadet said, I did a lot of research, and in my opinion, it has something to do with DNA. You all know what DNA is, right? There was a foreign material that analyzed the genetic similarity within the nation. According to this English material, Korea has the highest DNA homogeneity among its people. What that essentially means is that Korea has preserved its ethnic lineage exceptionally well over a long period. The cadet shared this with me, wondering if that's the reason behind Korea's distinct cultural identity. I responded, I'm not sure that's entirely correct, but I still encourage the cadet to research further and dig deeper into the topic. From our perspective, the reasons for this belief are likely rooted in other more significant aspects. This lecture is, in fact, based on content that True Mother has personally shared with us, step by step. Since this material is rooted in her words, there are aspects that may be interpreted differently from the perspectives of people in other countries. So I think that those aspects need to be incorporated in order for the discussion to be more universal. One significant concept we emphasize is that the Korean Han people were selected as the chosen people and prepared by heaven to send the true parents. And after the arrival of true parents, all blessed families who accepted and attend the true parents have also become the chosen people. Thus, they were the chosen people in order to send the true parents. And following that, all of us who have received the blessing now call the true parents our parents, don't we? In this sense, every blessed family that recognizes the true parents as their parents is also part of the chosen people. This is what I think. Then, in order to understand the will of Heavenly Parent, who chose the Korean Han people as the chosen people, we need to know what that will is. Only then, will it become clearer what we as blessed families should educate our children on and what core values we should pass on to them as we talk about our identity as blessed families. This does not mean we should all get blessed to a Korean, but rather it's about what we as blessed families think is most important in terms of our identity within our families. If we think about that together, it might be an interesting reflection. The topic I'm going to talk about today is the faith and culture that the Korean Han people have inherited. This lecture will introduce that. I believe Professor An Young-hee has probably explained it in detail earlier. In terms of faith, one of the key characteristics of the Korean people is Daemang Sasang, the Great Hope Theory. What is the Great Hope Theory? Or philosophy or thought? All Korean Han people have had a deep religious spirit and have been a people who believe strongly in religion. No matter what religion has entered in Korea, the Great Hope Theory consistently manifests itself. If we are to talk about what is so important about the Great Hope Theory, it is the belief that the current world is corrupt, and if it's corrupt, a new world will open. A new world would open, but when will it open? It's not that you die, go to heaven and enter a new world after death. Rather, the reality of the world we are living in itself will undergo some form of transformation. It's believed this transformation is brought about by the arrival of a new individual. This is the Great Hope theory that the Korean Han people have held for a long time. In Buddhism, for instance, there is the Buddha. But there is another Buddha who is believed to come to usher in a new world. So that Buddha is called the Maitreya Buddha. Now, while many people worship the Buddha in Korea, the faith of the Maitreya Buddha has developed significantly. This is why when you visit Buddhist temples in Korea, you'll often see a lot of Maitreya Buddhas. This isn't only in Buddhism, even in Confucianism. There has been a strong emphasis in becoming a wise man. What kind of person is a wise man? It's someone who is generous, benevolent, and lives for the sake of others. A person who acts and lives according to their conscience and moral principles. The belief is that such a wise man will come in the future. So Confucianism considers the existence of a wise person extremely important. So in Korea, what did Confucianists emphasize the most in Confucianism? We call it self-cultivation. This refers to the striving to live accordingly and live according to one's conscience and continuously working towards becoming a wise person. So, if there is a country that emphasizes the practice of not only living for every conscious life, but also being tolerant and loving others, it is Korea. In China, they say, Korea is a country of wise men, because of how deeply the practice of living as wise men was emphasized. Those who attain this ideal state of being were sometimes called sages. The concept of saint is closely tied to the idea of conscience. And there is a well-known saying that such individuals must live without shame when looking up to heavens. What does it mean to look up to heavens without feeling ashamed? It means we have a mission entrusted to us by heaven and we should fully accept and live faithfully, fulfilling that mission. It means to become a person who lives in accordance with the will of heaven. This idea highlights how in Korean Confucianism, practical application and moral conduct were especially emphasized. It is said that this became the foundation of Korean political thought. Furthermore, during times of turmoil, certain prophetic texts gained popularity, among which were the Jeongamnok. That's the prophecy of Jeongamnok and the Gyeongnam-yurok, Nam-sago prophecy. As discussed in the exposition of divine principle, these texts contain prophecies that, although differing slightly in content, commonly predict the coming of a person called a true person of the Jeong tribe. So because the current world is in a state of corruption, the sage king will come to save it. This savior figure is referred to as the true person of the Jeong tribe. This concept of a new world being opened by a destined individual is known as the dawning of the era after the coming of heaven. There are many words for this. When the new world opens, a person will come to lead and usher in that change. This is something that commonly comes from Korean religions. Likewise, the same goes for the Nam-sago prophecy. So, although the specific content vary, many prophecies share the common theme that the current world, which is filled with chaos and turmoil, will one day transform into a new world. At that pivotal moment, a sage king will appear, become the central figure of the world, and open the path to a new world. A person who will carry out the will of heaven will come. There are many books of prophecy like that. I don't know if you know, but there was something called the Donggak, Eastern learning. If we were to pinpoint the most chaotic time in Korea, it must have been when the country changed. And among those times, there was a time when the Joseon dynasty ended and a new modernization had to begin. And because the Korean Han people failed to respond well, the confusion got worse. During this time, Western culture began to enter Korea in large quantities, but they said, we cannot accept Western culture, we have to do it our way. This gave rise to the religion known as Eastern learning. Eastern learning can be seen as the synthesis of the core ideas from various religious and philosophical traditions that has been passed down in Korea, rather than creating something entirely new. Eastern learning organized the essential teachings and beliefs of Korea's existing religious thought. So what is being said here is that a dawning that completely turns the world upside down will happen, and at that time the era before the coming of heaven will end, and the era after the coming of heaven will begin. And what they are talking about is the ideology Shichonju, serving the Lord of heaven, which refers to a world where humanity and all things in heaven and earth serve and live in harmony with Heavenly Parent. This is what Eastern learning emphasizes. This is quite similar to our church. If we were to point out a shared keyword among the Korean religions that emerged after this period, it would be the idea of dawning of the era after the coming of heaven. In other words, they all speak about a new world that is coming. In order for that new world to open, we must live in attendance with our Heavenly Parent in our hearts. And this is what we have been talking about in Eastern learning. So that Eastern learning that was transformed into the religion of Chondoism, religion of celestial way, by its second leader, Song Byung-hui. In other words, Eastern learning was initially a form of thought, and it was developed into a complete organized religion called Chondoism. The core idea promoted by Chondoism is the Great Opening ideology. Specifically, the belief in the dawning of the era after the coming of heaven, as previously mentioned. One of the key teachings in this context is the concept of innechon, humans are heaven. This is considered a very unique Korean perspective. As I've studied the subject, one point that frequently comes up in Korean people is that the Korean people can feel Heavenly Parent directly when doing spiritual things. This is what the Korean people think. But in other countries, for example, intense spiritual practice often results in encounters with figures such as Jesus, saints, or angels. However, Koreans tend to experience the direct presence of Heavenly Parent after earnest prayer and sincere devotion. This isn't simply because they are Korean Han people, but rather because the Korean Han people inherently have a unique spiritual inclination. They don't perceive meeting Heavenly Parent as something that happens through intermediaries or other beings. Instead, they believe that they can directly experience Heavenly Parent and hear the voice of Heavenly Parent. Because of this strong sense of religious devotion, people are able to have such spiritual experiences. This is precisely why the concept of humans are heaven is emphasized here as well. So what happens after the dawning of the era after the coming of heaven is achieved? According to Chondoism, the kingdom of heaven on earth will be established. Summarizing this narrative, the important thing is that the Korean Han people have a long hoped for a new world, one distinct from the current reality, a peaceful world where everyone can live happily. That is the first key point. Second, they believe that the realization of this new world could not be achieved by human efforts alone. Instead, they waited for the arrival of a representative from heaven. Someone who can help humanity in opening this new world, who can bring about the dawning of the era of the coming of heaven. And third, it is that the religious spirit of the Korean people as a nation can communicate directly with heaven. Koreans believed that they could directly hear the voice of heaven and personally feel the presence of Heavenly Parent. Therefore, when we examine the unique religious spirit of the Korean people, these three characteristics stand out as the key differences from other nations. What I want to convey is that the blessed families are in fact not so different, aren't we? This isn't just something exclusive to the Korean people. While it's true that the Korean Han people have largely moved away from the mindset over time, if we talk about the foundation that Heavenly Parent prepared in order to send the true parents, they were raised to hope for a new world and the dawning of the era after the coming of heaven. And they waited for the heavenly representative who could do that to arrive. And they waited in hope that when that representative came, they would be able to communicate directly with Heavenly Parent. That's the story I wanted to share. Now, moving on, I'd like to explore how these religious ideas have been culturally embedded and passed down. Among the various cultural aspects, the most representative value is something known as hyojong, filial heart for God. Hyojong is simply put, filial piety. But what do you think? Is the filial piety that Koreans think of a little different from the filial piety that Japanese people think of? Yes. Thank you. Do you feel that it's different? Personally, I don't know. But there are many people who study this. They say that the filial piety is different. Since filial piety forms of the foundation of a family and society, I wonder if such values are universal, serving as the bedrock of humanity. Perhaps they aren't so different after all. At least, that's my initial thought. So, however, some people do point out specific differences. What do they think is the most important thing about filial piety? When Koreans talk about filial piety, it is self-sacrifice, the heart of children who sacrifice themselves to serve their parents, and the heart of loving their parents who are sacrificing themselves. That is how they say filial piety of the Korean people is. In some other ways, people say that this can seem a bit extreme, even frightening. One of their traditions was that after their parents passed away for 3 years, children quit everything they were doing, built a hut next to the grave and lived in the hut. The reason they lived there was because they felt they didn't serve their parents, so they thought of themselves as sinner and visited the grave every day like a sinner. This is called the 3 years of mourning. In fact, they say that filial piety towards parents is not at the rational or reasonable level that we think it is, but rather Korean filial piety is something that goes beyond that. In Korea, there is a college entrance exam. Among the various entrance exams, there is also something called an essay exams. For example, a question might be, discuss whether Shim Jung throwing herself into the Indang Sea can truly be considered filial piety. There were many stories about this, to the point that it was included in the essay questions. If you look at old Korean stories about filial piety, you'll find that many of them are actually quite frightening. For instance, there are stories where the parents have nothing to eat and are ill, and it is said that they will only recover if they eat meat. So what happens is that the child cuts the flesh from their own thighs, cooks it, and serves it to their ailing parents. After eating it, the parent recovers. There is an old story like that. There is another story where the parents are sick, and just like in many others, they are very poor and nothing to eat, and the parents remain ill. Meanwhile, the baby keeps crying all the time because it is hungry and has nothing to eat, constantly taking the little food that should go to the parents. So what happens in the story? It tells a situation where, in desperation, they decide to kill the child. Such extreme stories also exist. Children can be born again, but since I only have one set of parents, in order to be filial to these parents, it's fine for my child to die. There are old stories like this. It's scary, right? I also find them a little frightening. A professor who studied this said that the filial piety in Korea is in the general reasonable level of filial piety that we think of, but filial piety that goes beyond that. What he was talking about was why, when the Koreans talk about filial piety, do they emphasize filial piety that goes beyond their own life or even the life of their children. The concept of filial piety is not about viewing parents simply as human beings who gave birth to me, or physical parents who did something for me, so I repay them with filial duty. It is not a matter on that level. Rather, parents are regarded as the source of one's life, because they are the root of one's existence. It was thought that it is only natural to give one's life for this root. This is the way Koreans were educated, which is why such stories were prevalent in the past. This story refers to the heart of filial piety that Heavenly Parent instilled in the Korean Han people. This heart refers to the idea that if you trace back through the ancestors of ancestors, at the very root there is Heavenly Parent. Therefore, it is said that the heart to love, the very source of one's life, was given to the people, and this is considered very important. This is why it is said that the Korean Han people had such a deep sense of filial piety. Another point, as I mentioned earlier, is the idea of sharing the same DNA. One of the important aspects of having the same DNA is the emphasis on purity, because the culture strongly stressed the purity and chastity. It was taught that the lineage must not be tainted and the lineage must be preserved. These ideas were greatly emphasized. I grew up as a second-generation member, and during my childhood there was a separate education program for second-generation members in Korea. We, the second generation, received a special training. We would gather separately, and although I don't clearly remember whether it started in elementary school or middle school, I recall that we underwent this education for second-generation members every summer vacation. One thing I still vividly remember is when I was around 6th grade in elementary school. I was very young at the time, and during the lecture on Divine Principle, the lecturer says something like this: all of you here, second-generation members from blessed families, were born without original sin and are children of Heavenly Parent. Then they posed the question, but what if you were ever raped or sexually assaulted? What should you do? I was listening in an innocent state, wondering, what is that person talking about? And then they said, in that case, you must die. They went on to say that we should carry a silver ornament knife, and if we ever found ourselves in such a situation, instead of defending ourselves by harming the attacker, we should use it to take our own life. You must die, they said. Hearing that, I remember feeling frightened and thinking, this is scary. That kind of teaching from a lecturer reflected the long-standing cultural emphasis in Korea on purity and chastity, especially for women. It was taught that one's lineage and purity must be protected at all costs, and purity was considered more important than life itself. It is said that from a young age in Korea, we were taught that one must protect it with their life, even at its risk. So when it comes to purity and chastity, the question is, for whom is this purity and chastity for? It is for heaven. As I said before, in order to live without shame in front of heaven, it is not a matter of who says something about me or not, but I must keep my purity and chastity to become me, who is not ashamed before heaven. And that is how we have been educated. So about women, I was talking to some people earlier, and we shared many interesting things about among the UPS students at our school. They are Korean and Japanese cadets, and what is really interesting is that for the students, whether they are Korean cadets or Japanese cadets doesn't really matter. If you say, raise your hand if your mother is Japanese, then about 70 to 80% of them raise their hands saying their mother is Japanese.
그러면은 엄마가 일본 사람인 사람이 한 70% 80%가 엄마가 일본 사람입니다. 그 생도제 엄마. So what's even more fascinating is that many of the students who come from Japan actually have Korean mothers. 엄마가 한국 사람이에요. You understand what I mean, right? Because of the cross-cultural blessings from the past, Korean women were all blessed to Japanese members who went to Japan, right? And the students who were born there, so they are Japanese cadets, but most of their mothers are Korean. And they are Korean cadets, but their mothers are Japanese, right? Our blessed families are all Korean. The concept of nations doesn't really have much meaning. That's how we're living now. But what's interesting is that the cadets from Japan are here together. But you can tell whose mother is Korean. The professors can often tell who has a mother from Korea, even without being told. They'll ask, it's you, right? Your mother's Korean, isn't she? Why is that? Is it because they speak Korean well? It's funny. There are really a lot of men here, but it doesn't matter if the father is Korean. Even if their father is Korean, the kids can speak Korean.
They can't speak Korean. We only know that their father is Korean if they say so. They actually say, my father is Korean. He did missionary work somewhere and is pastor here. And I ask who they are every time. Fathers don't have much influence. But the kids whose mothers are Korean speak Korean well. And their voices are loud. Those of you who are laughing, you understand what I mean, right? The kids whose mothers are Korean, their voices are loud, and depending on the situation, they speak anytime. They come to our professor's office, knock at the door, and sometimes just open the door and walk in. But the kids whose mothers are Japanese never do that. They're very quiet. They're quiet because they don't want to cause any trouble. They never do that. They're very quiet. They're quiet because they don't want to cause any trouble. However, Korean women are often said to be very strong and scary. The reason for this is that, as I mentioned earlier, Korean women place a great importance on their purity and chastity. And when it comes to raising children, they emphasize that children should live according to their conscience so that they raise their children well. In history, we see figures like Shim Saidang, or mother of Han Sok-bong, or Chunyang. Although Chunyang is not a real person, in the story she's depicted as a woman who risked her life to preserve her chastity, isn't she? Therefore, there is a historical reason why Korean women became very strong. It is because there was a culture of wanting to preserve purity and live according to one's conscience. The reason why the Korean Han people tried to maintain this culture of purity and chastity is that they valued family relations and placed great importance on family love. Recently, I've been reading many papers comparing Japan and Korea, as I'm writing a paper on the topic. Among the papers I have read, there is one that discusses the difference between Korean and Japanese families. It refers to the Japanese family as Ie, patrilineal household. When talking about the differences between Korean and Japanese families, what is mentioned is that in Korea, family means having the same lineage. So the culture places great importance on lineage. On the other hand, in Japan, the concept of family is more focused on kamon, family crest, meaning people who live together as part of the same community. That's what is more emphasized. I have read a paper that makes this comparison based on the atmosphere here. It seems that you might not think the same way here, but in that paper, it was presented like that. So the culture of filial duty, family, marriage, and child rearing in Korea became stronger because there was a great importance placed on the bloodline and a deep appreciation for it. Through this family love, the Korean Han people had the tendency to overcome and solve even the most impossible situations. This is the kind of story that was shared. So what about our blessed families? Even though you don't tell your children to study hard, you do tell them that they must receive the blessing, right? What does this mean? It means that you want them to preserve the lineage of the blessed families. That is the mindset, isn't it? In fact, I think this is one of the characteristics passed down from the Korean Han people, and it is being carried on in the blessed families. If you look at the Korean history, there is a long history of trying to maintain this identity of being the chosen people. The Korean Han people really liked wearing the white hanbok. That is why we are called the white-clad race. The reason they liked wearing the white clothes is because they liked the bright sunlight, purity and peace. So they wore these clothes. Some people say it was because they didn't have money to dye the fabric, but I don't think that was the case. The reason is that during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese people saw the Koreans wearing white hanbok and were trying to preserve their identity as the Korean people, and they continue wearing the white hanbok for that reason. So during the period of Japanese rule over Korea, there was even a law made to prohibit Koreans from wearing white hanbok. This shows that this wasn't because the Korean people didn't have clothes, but rather because they wore the white hanbok so much. They continued wearing white hanbok as a symbol of their national identity and spirit of resistance. Historically, this shows that the Korean Han people have had the tendency to like the color white and purity since ancient times. When we look at the map of Korea, Korea is actually a very small country. It's smaller than Japan, right? Japan is made up of islands, but Korea is really a small country. So Korea inevitably had to face invasions from China. But there has been a history of trying to preserve the identity of its people and national independence against such invasions. There was a General Ulji Mundok of Goguryeo, right? But what's interesting is that when these people went to war with China, what did we just say? The scale was not sufficient in terms of numbers, but using various strategies, they fought the war. While we make efforts and devise strategies in order to carry them out, the weather and the other circumstances must align. So it is often said that they prayed to the heavens. In other words, before going to battle, we do everything we can in terms of strategy, but after that, the rest is up to the heavens to help them. They prayed that the heavens would help them. Isn't this something that we often do as well? We make all efforts we can. We do everything in our power. And then we hope that heavens will help us, right? In fact, the Korean people have had a long history of this. There is also King Gwanggaeto the Great. In the case of King Gwanggaeto the Great, now I understand how this works. When I explain it this way, I thought I was the one clicking next. But it turns out there is someone clicking for me. Okay. In the case of King Gwanggaeto the Great, it is mentioned that he expanded his territory all the way to Manchuria. However, the reason for expanding into Manchuria was not to invade China, but to demonstrate our country's sovereignty and to protect the territory of our nation. So the Korean Han people in any situation must have worked hard to develop the identity as the chosen people given by Heavenly Parent and to strengthen the sovereignty of our nation. During the Goryeo dynasty, there was also General Kang Kam-chan and Tripitaka Koreana, which is very difficult to create. The reason for making this was the hope that the heavens will help them as they formed the scripture during the wartime. These efforts were truly our own. In fact, in the national anthem it says, God will protect us, right? This has appeared several times throughout the Korean history. When Japan invaded, Admiral Lee Sun-shin created the turtle ship and did many things, but he was severely outnumbered. There was a diary that Admiral Lee Sun-shin wrote before he went out. In the diary, he prayed for the protection of Heavenly Parent so that the weather and the situation would allow him to carry out all strategies he had planned. He also had an experience where a spiritual being appeared and gave him guidance, telling him what to do. All of this is written in his diary, so the Korean Han people, in order to protect and preserve their sovereignty, were a people who always prayed to heaven. It wasn't just Admiral Lee Sun-shin during the Imjin War. Many people did the same. I'm not sure if it's appropriate for me to give this example, especially from the Japanese church leaders, so I'm being a bit cautious. I think I mentioned this briefly last time, but Taiwan really likes Japan. While Korea, despite being under Japanese rule for 40 years, never assimilated to Japan at all.
대만은 되게 일본을 좋아하는데 한국은 40년이나 지배를 받았는데 일본에 전혀 동화가 안 됐어요.
They were very unique people. So when Korea is under foreign rule, they don't think about how good the rule is, how much it develops its people, or what benefits it brings to them. They don't think about such things. Even during the Imjin War, Korea was in a situation where it was inevitable that they would lose to Japan. But what happened? The entire nation came together. But the king is the one who fled. When the war breaks out and the king flees, what happens? Since the king fled, the people could have said, we will just follow the new ruler. But there was none of that. It had nothing to do with the king. Instead, the people said, I will protect this country. And monks, who were traditionally forbidden from taking life, went into battle. Also, in every village, there were many people who volunteered to protect the country, known as the Righteous Army. This is something that is extremely rare in world history, and it continues to appear throughout history. So during the Imjin War, it wasn't the king of the ruling dynasty who protected the country, but the people themselves, who unconditionally protected the nation. The history is well recorded. Of course, during the Japanese colonial period, so many independence fighters emerged. Even though Japan ruled Korea for 40 years, during this time, they tried to reform the Korean people's consciousness, which was called consciousness reformation. Despite this, many independent activists organized independence armies and freed all the slaves in their households. And among those who fought for independence, this person named Lee Ho-yeon is very famous. People like An Jung-gun sacrificed their lives for this movement, especially An Jung-gun, who is considered a terrorist in Japan, is actually regarded as a peace activist in Korea today. When he assassinated Ito Hirobumi of Japan, what he said was that during Japan's rule over Korea, Japan said that it would protect the peace of the East with a peaceful heart, creating a justification for its action. However, in reality, the situation was not peaceful. They were doing it very forcefully, and it was wrong. Japan had claimed that it would protect Korea and the East from Western invasions. However, it was not doing so. He wrote a theory called On Peace in East Asia, saying that to maintain peace in East, such actions were not acceptable. He also wrote books discussing peace movements on various topics. So the Korean Han people, in their DNA, desire peace, and they have no intention of dominating other nations. Instead, they believe in maintaining peace while respecting the individuality of each nation. So that was the Oriental peace theory. You are probably familiar with Yu Guan-sun, who, at the very young age, led the independence movement with a pure spirit. She was a Christian who fought for independence. This is the history of her participation in the independence movement as a Christian. Shin Jae-ho, another figure when Japan ruled Korea, focused a lot on questioning why Korea should be under Japan's rule. He worked hard to change the colonial viewpoint and historical perspective. He argued that the Korean people were a nation that needed to be beaten to listen, incapable of organizing on their own, and fond of fighting. Because the Korean people were considered a very problematic nation, Japan promoted the idea that it had to govern Korea. This was a message that was heavily emphasized throughout the Japanese colonial period. However, Shin Jae-ho argued that this was not true. The Korean Han people are not like that. And the origin of the Korean Han people begins with the myth of Dangun. The Korean Han people have a strong national identity, and to maintain this and develop this identity, we need to examine the efforts made throughout history to preserve it. Shin Jae-ho is the one who reinterpreted the history in this way. I've mentioned several people, but the important thing is that the Korean Han people have made great efforts to preserve their own identity. The foundation for these efforts is, as you must have heard from Professor An Young-hee's lecture, the idea of being the chosen people, which is a national identity rooted in the heaven's descendants taught. So the belief of being descendants of heaven. Because of this identity, the Korean Han people try to protect their country beyond the practical interest of whether it is beneficial or not. And we have made efforts to preserve our identity as chosen people. I think that we can say the same thing about the blessed families, because the blessed families are the ones who first came to know true parents. And we are making efforts to preserve our identity as blessed families. Next. If we believe this, because we have realistic interest, what benefits do we gain from believing this? I think we need to transcend realistic interest and make efforts to protect our Chonaguk and to maintain our identity as blessed families as the chosen people. Lastly, I would like to talk about the creativity and the culture of the heart that the Korean Han people possess. This seems to be something that Professor An Young-hee mentioned. Among Korean culture, one of the most representative elements is the Korean alphabet Hangul. Hangul has a very unique writing system. Then you might ask, does Japan not have a writing system? Japan does have a writing system, of course, but what makes Hangul particularly unique is that it was created by someone. Sejong the Great created it. There is no record of who created any language, but this is a language that was created through scientific research. Hangul was created to be a script that can write and express all sounds. But why did Sejong the Great create it? He could have used Chinese characters, but it would be too difficult for ordinary people to study Chinese characters and write our language, so he thought, this won't work. He said that Hangul was created out of love for the people, so that all the people could write. In fact, in some ways, it was Heavenly Parent who gave him this idea, and Hangul was created out of love for the people.
어떤 면에서는 하늘 부모님이 아이디어를 주셔서 사실은 이렇게 백성을 사랑하는 마음으로 만들어진 것이 한글이다.
So if you look at all of this is discussed in the exposition of the Divine Principle. However, in the 1950s and 60s, when the exposition of the Divine Principle was written, did people really feel the Hangul would become a world language and that Korea would become the center of the world? I wish that were the case. I think Koreans hoped for that as well. We are now witnessing the history of that coming true. Today, there are Korean language schools around the world and people are singing along to Korean songs. We are living in a time where the contents written in the Divine Principle are coming to fruition. But why is Hangul important here? It is because Hangul was created as a script to express God's bitter sorrow and deep heart. We understand it like this. Another thing is that science and technology have greatly developed. Among the fields of science, astronomy, which is the study of heavens, has developed significantly. And the study of the time was more advanced in Korea compared to other countries. Another thing is the development of printing technology. As you all know, the Korean people developed printing technology. Why did printing technology develop? It was because of the love for truth, as there was a desire to record the scriptures and pass them down to future generations. This is why printing technology was developed faster in Korea than anywhere else in the world. So therefore, the development of the printing technology and the creation of the Hangul were driven by a strong desire to share the truth with future generations so that all the nations could share together. I'm not sure if you know this, but many other countries, the ruling class did not want to share their writing system. In other countries, the elite kept the writing system to themselves, and they were not pleased when the common people learned about it, as it meant that knowledge would be shared. However, Korea was different. The culture here was not about keeping knowledge to the elite. It was about studying, sharing, and passing on the truth to everyone, and that's why these things developed. And since there was a lot of farming, agricultural technology which could change the lives of common people, things developed. Let me talk briefly about ceramics. There was the Koryo Celadon and Joseon white porcelain. Although there were some elegant examples here, I'm not sure what the booklets show. They say Japan's ceramics were much more developed, right? Japanese ceramics are truly beautiful, and when I travel abroad, I see the ceramic technology has developed greatly in foreign countries as well, with many very beautiful and exquisite pieces.
일본이 도자기가 정말 너무 예뻐요. 그리고 제가 외국에 가보면은 외국도 굉장히 도자기 기술이 발전돼가지고 너무너무 화려하고 예쁜 것들이 많이 있더라고요.
However, a unique feature of Korean ceramics is that after the beautiful Koryo Celadon, instead of continuing to develop into more ornate designs, Joseon white porcelain emerged, often with no patterns at all. This shift is quite distinctive. Despite the potential for more elaborate designs with techniques like inlaying during the Joseon dynasty, this trend stopped and shifted to plain white porcelain.
하는 게 발전이 되면 점점점 발전되면 더 화려한 방향으로 가게 되는데 여기서 갑자기 조선 시대에 오면서 그게 딱 멈추고 백자로 가게 됩니다. 이 백자가 가게 되는 것이 뭐냐면
The development of the plain white porcelain in the Joseon dynasty reflects a mindset focused on living with integrity. The emphasis was on purity and cleanliness, symbolizing a heart free of distractions. This culture was about seeking a pure spirit aligned with the heavens. In conclusion, the identity of the Korean Han people, I believe, laid the foundation to send out true parents. Now, as blessed families, we are tasked with embracing and embodying the cultural identity while attending true parents. So the Great Hope theory is rooted in our religious spirit to build that world while attaining true parents and the culture of attaining Heavenly Parent. To attain Heavenly Parent, there has to be a culture where we are willing to sacrifice our lives. Our identity as the chosen people, the nation selected by Heavenly Parent, has been preserved throughout history. In order to do that, we put in our best efforts, put in all the efforts we can. And there was a culture of praying for Heavenly Parent to work. And there was a culture of heart that creatively developed that. And it is important to understand it in this way.
문화가 있었고 그것을 창조적으로 발전시켜온 심정 문화가 있었다. 이렇게 이해해 주시면 좋겠습니다.
Yes, this concludes my lecture. When I first gave this lecture to Korean church leaders, I mentioned that this lecture should actually be given by church leaders, not professors. This is not an academic matter, nor is it about researching Korean history and presenting findings. What we are talking about is what true parents have said about the Korean Han people and what we as blessed families should do in the future and how we should live. In fact, since there are Japanese church leaders here, I think that it would be good if you could develop it further and convey to your members.
앞으로 우리가 축복 가정들이 어떻게 해야 할 것인가, 어떻게 살아갈 것인가를 이야기하는 그런 내용이기 때문에 사실은 여기 일본 목회자들이 다 계신데 여러분께서 더 발전시켜가지고 식구님들에게 많이 전달해 주시면 좋겠다 그런 생각이 듭니다.
So with this, I will end my lecture today. Thank you very much.